Okay, good evening, and welcome to this first online seminar from Blaydes Maritime Centre. We hope the technology cooperates. It gives me great pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. Jo Stanley, who is one of our honorary research fellows at the Blaydes Maritime Centre. She's also an honorary research fellow at Liverpool John Moores University. Jo has done a huge amount of work over the years on what you might call minority seafarers of all sorts. She's written on LGBT seafarers, she's written on women at sea, she's written on ethnic minorities at sea. She does a huge amount of work with the heritage sector of all sorts, museums and so on, with community groups, with seafarers organisations themselves. This evening, she's here to talk to us about Ayahs and Lascars at sea in the late 19th, early 20th century. So without further ado, over to you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Martin. Right. Hello, everybody. Really good to see you, I'd like to say, but really good to imagine you instead. This evening, behind the scenes is Claire, who's going to be changing these slides, so I'll be asking her to change the slides quite a lot. I feel really proud as a historian to be involved in this historical first broadcast from Blaydes, and I hope you enjoy it. Next slide, please, Claire. So the full title is Anything Like Lascars, Race, Gender and Ayahs as Working Passengers, 1850 to 1950. And when I say Ayahs, I'm really referring to Amahs too, but I'm saying Ayahs for short. And the interesting thing about Ayahs and Amahs is that they were working passengers. They were employees in maritime, and we don't often look in maritime at the people who were only sort of employers as opposed to deckies and captains and pirates and stewardesses. Next slide, please, Jenny. Claire. So this is what I'm going to be talking about this evening. I'm going to be defining Ayahs and Lascars, then going over my aims for this talk, and then thinking about why these people from the past matter today. I'll be looking at what Ayahs' voyages were like and comparing the status of Ayahs and Lascars. And then I'll be looking at their lives at sea compared before drawing to a conclusion. I'm very deliberately choosing to compare Lascars and Ayahs so that we can see the ways that Ayahs were and were not nothing like these other Asian seagoing workers. Next slide, please, Claire. Right, so definitions. Next slide, please, Claire. You probably already know this, but just to remind you that Indian and Chinese nannies, respectively, were employed by European families. These women were from India, Ceylon, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai, China, and Japan. And we know that they were working for British and European expat families from at least the 1650s. The last one I found coming to England was in 1953. And ayahs are important because although they're women, they were the key women in the colonial households. So they were the only women in the native staff, which might be between 11 to 25 personnel, depending on how wealthy and prestigious the family was. So here was this woman who was absolutely crucial to the functioning of a household. Next slide, please, Claire. So Ayahs and Amahs meanings. It's very important to recognise that these were not sweaty labourers, but genteel. They were looking after the children. They were brushing the Memsahib's hair. They were not getting filthy in the bowels of the ship with the coal or with the oil. And anyway, they were doing women's work, which, as we know, still in society is coded as of less value or no value. And rather peculiarly, they were in the family in which they were working, they were both loved and suspected as intimate members. There was a lot of emotional feelings about could she be trusted to be loyal to us, and was she really as kind and loyal as we thought she seemed to be. So in talking about Ayahs and Amahs, obviously I'm talking about intersectionality tonight. They were women of many different colours. So colour, gender, they were female, they were lowly, class, and they had fluctuating agency. So some might have felt they had some power in the household, and yet they did not. They were very much at the behest of the private employers. The really key thing about ayahs is that they were privately contracted labour. They were doing work that was infused by tenderness. They loved the kids they looked after, the kids loved them. But this contract was also confused by tenderness. If you think about perhaps your granny or parents today who are looked after by carers who come in, on the one hand, the contracted labourer, the carer, is doing whatever she is supposed to do in the 15 minutes that's agreed, which might be wash, dress, and quickly vacuum clean the place or something like that. But on the other hand, the relationship is confused by tenderness, because if the carer loves your granny or your mum, she may well want to look after them and give them the conversation they want and stay on longer, which then affects her relationship with her subsequent customers. So it is a complex relationship that an ayah or an amah was in. This is non-alienated labour. They're not shoveling coal, and they are producing well-being for roughly 5 passengers. That would be the average size of a family that was travelling across to Britain or back to India or Hong Kong. So these ayahs and amahs were not contributing to the vessel's progress in reaching the destination safely and profitably. They were working on the emotional stuff, the love, if you like, the tenderness. Next slide, please, Claire. So it's useful to think about them like modern Filipina maids today. This is a poster that was produced quite recently, in my terms, only 10 years ago, by Aware, Dignity Overdue campaign. And what it says very clearly is that this maid, like an ayah or amah, she's not just your maid, she has a name, it's Lita. And this is important because most amahs in the records were described as ayah or amah. It's very, very rare. Maybe in 15% of cases do you see an ayah actually named with her own name. And this modern poster also points out she works for her family as well as yours. She's working for the wealthy employer in order to keep her own family going. And it argues give her a day off, which of course was quite an unusual idea because for ayahs and amahs they worked 24/7, particularly on ships. Next slide, please, Claire. So they're unlike Filipina maids, these ayahs and amahs, because they're imbricated in very time-specific colonial loyalties and tensions too. They were part of a time when England and Britain had a very specific relationship with this colony, India, and areas too, like Singapore and Hong Kong. And unlike Lita, the woman in the previous poster, our ayahs and amahs were not foreign domestic workers, but actually employed by foreigners, European people, in her own invaded country, particularly India. Next slide, please, Claire. So why were they afloat? They were afloat because elite expats went to and fro to Britain, to home. Sometimes they went on furlough, which would be every 3 to 5 years. Sometimes the ayahs went singly with the children as couriers taking the kids to boarding school. And childcare was needed on the ship because the memsahbs, the mothers in these employing families, were very unskilled as mothers. They'd been waited on for so long in India that they didn't really know how to look after kids. And this was particularly crucial in a dangerous place like the ship because it seemed like a playground. So what an ayah and amah would endlessly be saying, as you can imagine, is keep away from that rail, be careful, we don't want you to go overboard. This picture here shows two ayahs, which is quite unusual. There would be between 1 and 5 ayahs on a ship, normally maximum. So to see two in a picture is quite rare, and you'll notice that the one in pink is at the margins, the one in yellow is quite central. Next slide, please, Claire. So just to paint you a picture of one ayah, and I think this is the most extreme case. We don't know her name, it was just ayah. And this is a terrible travel rage incident that happened on the Violette, a steamship going from Ceylon, Sri Lanka, to the UK in 1885. Mr. and Mrs. Abbott were sailing with their two children, who were 6 and 2. And this is what the newspaper report said. Soon after leaving Colombo, Mrs. Abbott had reason to rebuke the ayah, who seemed much grieved and excited. In consequence of a remark she let fall, the children and nurse were closely watched. Later, Mr. Abbott was sitting with them in the saloon, but went to get a cup of tea and turned his back for a moment. As he did so, the woman, the ayah, seized the eldest child, a beautiful fair-headed girl, and thrust her through one of the ports, and then jumped out herself. Both fell into the sea, and although the steamer was stopped, nothing could be seen of the child. There was great consternation and regret, the children being great favourites on board, and nothing was said of the ayah. But this is a very interesting example of the way that tensions, particularly after 3 weeks, could build up so badly on a ship. Next slide, please. So to define Lascars a bit, this is probably the most iconic picture of them. You're probably very familiar with it. These were Indian sailors, but the term was expanded to mean non-European. And they were sailing from at least the 1600s for the East India Company. And they did so partly to fill gaps on ships from India because so many British seafarers had deserted or died in India that Asian seafarers needed to be picked up to run the ship. I have got flu, so excuse me if I blow my nose. So their roles included ABs, seamen, deckhands, cooks, firemen, trimmers, and stokers. And their status, of course, was extremely low, and their life extremely harsh. And they lived their life on ship collectively with other Asian men, segregated from the white people. That's crew and passengers. Next slide, please, Claire. So this is a story of one Lascar very early on. There aren't many ways to identify these men and get stories of them, but this is one I found that was quite telling in 1785. His name was Sawney Clough. He'd come over from India, and he was at the Old Bailey. He took his case to trial there. He claimed that a Royal Navy seafarer called Patrick Caulfield, who'd been in the RN for 10 years, assaulted him near the Blue Anchor pub in Deptford. So the court said to Sawney Clough, "What did he, Caulfield, say or do to you?" And Sawney Clough said, "He asked me if I had got any money. I told him I had got no money. He struck me first, and then he robbed me. There were two men. One struck me, and the other robbed me. I was knocked down upon the ground." "Did you lose your senses?" the court asked. "Yes." Sawney went on to say that he had been called a black bugger as well, which obviously is not only racist, but implies that he's a sexual pervert. And very interestingly, but not rarely, the judge decided in favour of the Asian man, and Caulfield was not just charged with a number of years in prison, but actually executed for this. Next slide, please, Claire. So my aim tonight is to show Ayahs and Amahs' significance in the wider maritime labour story, and to compare them with Lascars and to show the difference gender made in this maritime workforce that was so mixed. Next slide, please, Claire. So why do Ayahs and Amahs and Lascars matter today? Then very important overlooked evidence of intersectionality afloat, which is a subject we still don't know enough about, thinking about gender, race, class, and sexuality and disability too. And all these people had exceptional mobility for non-elite natives, if you like, of the period. And their personal history is barely known, so therefore the more we can find out or imagine, the better. Next slide, please, Claire. So you'll be wondering how many we're talking about. It's not as many as initially thought. I've been using part of the COVID period to do a lot of number crunching, and I found that there were 1,292 ayahs going to and from the UK, and just 437 Amahs going to and from the UK. So Amahs, the Chinese women, were a much smaller number. Next slide, please, Claire. And you can see here the pictures of the arrivals over the period 1890 to 1960. So the dark blue column is the ayahs, the paler blue column is the Amahs. So you can see in the 1890s there were a lot of ayahs arriving, about 300 in those years in the 1890s, going down to 200-ish in the 1900s, and roughly staying the same in the 1910s. It would have been going up, but of course World War I got in the way, so there was a period when there were no ayahs travelling, and then very quickly, 1920, there was a huge flow of ayahs and Amahs and memsahibs again. In the 1930s, as you see, the numbers went down really low. In the 1940s, surprisingly, no travel at all by ayahs and Amahs. You'd think there'd be a bit, but there's none. And then in the 1950s, they just about tailed off, which was partly because of political events happening in India and partly because people were flying, not sailing. Next slide, please, Claire. So by contrast to this tiny number of ayahs and Amahs, just four figures, Lascar numbers were quite big. In 1802, there was 224, but by 1813, this had gone up to 1,300. By 1891, it had gone up to 24,000, and they were 10% of all UK seafarers. And then in 1901, they went up to 37,000, or 14%, and by 1911, 45,000 Lascars were coming to and fro to Britain, which was 16% of the maritime labour force. So a really significant number. Next slide, please, Claire. I'm going to look at one particular year, 1901, which is pretty much slap bang in the middle of the Raj, really, which ran from 1858 to 1947. In 1901, there were nearly 200,000 British people working in India. The only way I can figure out to work out how many ayahs and Amahs there might have been is to think that there might have been one for every 8 British people. So that's what I've gone on. So there might have been 25,000 ayahs and Amahs in India. Next slide, please, Claire. But very few came over here. As you see, in 1901, large numbers of Lascars and seafarers, 5 figures and 6 figures, but the ayahs who arrived in the UK numbered only 14, and the Amahs who arrived here were only 10 in number, by contrast to the UK population of 32.5 million. So when ayahs came, they were very interesting figures because of their colourful clothes and their usual appearance, particularly at a time before TV and movies. But they were very small numbers, and because of their small numbers, of course, they were stared at like this ayah sitting on Plymouth Hoe around about 1910. Next slide, please, Claire. So the significance of these ayahs was that they were the very first black and brown women business travellers. The domestic role they had enabled motility, meaning this hence that one can travel, one can be mobile. So they're an overlooked and gendered part of Black and ethnic minority labour history. And they're part of what Michael Fisher has very interestingly described as the counterflow to colonialism. They were travelling back rather than being Brits travelling out to see the world. And they came and they went. They weren't immigrants or permanently itinerant workers. They were moving. And it's worth saying that in some religions they lost caste by sailing, so they had to find ways to get it back. So the job they had, as you see from this ayah in the cart, the rickshaw, is that the job required motility and mobility and conferred it on them too. So they were travelling all over the place in trains and bullock carts, but not on bikes. This is a Sinhalese ayah in a rickshaw. Next slide, please, Claire. So ayahs were these lonely, lowly women on the move as part of their working life, and they were accompanying the powerful foreigners. So you can see from the little arrow on the right that I think that is an ayah holding some kind of bundle, and then there are the two mahouts by the elephant and on top of the elephant to the left of the picture. So they are part of this picture of the movement that happened because the empire and colonial life involved travel for everyone. Next slide, please, Claire. So what were their voyages like? Next slide, Claire. The principal shipping lines, as you can imagine, as maritime historians, are that they were working for P&O and the companies that it took over, including British India and Orient Lines. And this route was mainly Plymouth, London and Tilbury, going on to Colombo and Australia, China and Japan after India. A lot was sailing on Henderson and Anchor lines from Birkenhead to Rangoon and Egypt, and quite a few were on Bibby lines sailing from Liverpool to India and the Far East. Next slide, please, Claire. So their pay. We have tracked down one woman called Carolyn Pereira, who, as you can imagine from her name, sounds like she's Portuguese origin. She was supposed to be paid 300 rupees, which is £30, for her pay for crossing the ocean in 1849. And this was a fairly typical rate for the trip, which before steam and before the Suez Canal opened could be as long as 6 months. So quite a sum. And £30 means 75 weeks wages for a UK female clerk in that time. And today, very roughly, I think this is an underestimation, it's about £2,400. So it was good pay, but not colossal if you were doing the trip for a very long time. And Carolyn Pereira said she expected, in quotes, to have my passage paid back. That is always usual when nurses come over to this country. Passage back would otherwise cost me 20 shillings, a pound. So just to give you some sense of proportion there, one passenger from Southampton to Bombay, which was taking 28 days under steam, was £85 in 1860 in the general cabin, not in a single cabin. And also, for comparison, Lascars got roughly 1/7 of white seafarers' pay. So I think, I haven't been able to work this out, is that the Lascars were getting less pay than ayahs because they were less genteel, they were less rated, less valued. Thank you, Claire. Next one. Ayahs were really crucial on ships. If you've been on a cruise ship today, you know there's all sorts of activities going on all the time. But children were not catered for really until the 1920s, when nursery stewardesses started. And then in the 1960s, when children's hostesses, nicknamed Chili Hose, started really entertaining the kids a bit, and you started getting the first kind of interesting experiences like bouncy castles. And then in the 1990s, youth hosts started, particularly influenced by Disney voyages, so that kids expected to be entertained and excited on every part of the trip. This is not what ayahs could do in their time. Next slide, Claire. So a typical day at sea for an ayah would be that she would wake around 6 or earlier, wake and dress the kids, supervise their breakfast, entertain them, including in the nurseries that ships were increasingly having from 1900, and they would take nursery lunch separately from the grown-up passengers. If you could, you would get the kids to rest at just after lunch at 2. Then there'd be deck sports, including quoits and badminton and races. And races included things like light the gentleman's cigarette and thread the needle. So a team would rush from one side to the other and try to be the first to light the man's cigarette. At nursery tea, about 4:30, that would be when the ayahs would again be looking after the children who, like ayahs in any posh house, like kids in any posh house ashore, they'd be dining separately with Nanny in the nursery. They wouldn't be taking dinner with the parents. About 7, if she could, the ayah would get the kids to bed, and then she would be babysitting while the parents were dining with all the adults in the dining room. If she was lucky, she'd get to bed by 10:30. If people were seasick, then she could have a disturbed night. She would be sleeping with the kids, normally on a bedroll at the foot of their bed or by their door. Next slide, please, Claire. So what made the Ayahs voyages vary? Two things, the ship and their shipmates. So obviously sail and steam, and the facilities accorded to Ayahs, which improved as time went on. The seaworthiness of the vessel really affected their voyage, and the season, which affected how seasick everybody was. So even if the ayah wasn't seasick, she might be looking after, say, 4 people who were feeling sick and sorry for themselves. And ayahs varied very much in their accommodation. So some would be sailing in first class with their employers, and some would be sailing deck class, which meant that they were in fairly public conditions, mixed sex, in a less sheltered and privileged situation. Also, the ayahs would be affected by how many previous ships they'd done, so they knew what to expect, and their own attitudes to change. Not everybody is as good at coping with fluidity as you have to on ship as others are. So their shipmates, employers' attitudes, whether an employer was kind or strict, mattered. The number of kids and how compliant the kids were mattered very much. You could imagine that some children were very spoilt and didn't want to obey Ayahs and Amahs, and indeed it's one of the main complaints by parents that Ayahs and Amahs spoilt the kids and didn't discipline them enough. And I like to think that the presence of other Ayahs, which could be none or could be 6 to 8, would have made the trip happier for the ayah that she'd have had company. There were also other natives, in quotes, women and men in deck class, and there seems to be some racism from the stewards. An area of maritime history that I hope somebody is going to look at soon is the attitude of stewards and stewardesses to the servants who were travelling on ships. I think this is an area of very interesting tension, including annoyance about tipping. And what we don't know is how Ayahs and Amahs connected with Lascars. We don't know if they would chat with them or go down and see them or even perhaps recognise a cousin. Next slide, please, Claire. So comparing Ayahs and Amahs and Lascars at sea. Next slide, please, Claire. Very different worlds for these human units of labour. On the one hand, as I hope I've made clear, the ayah was in a very domestic situation within the family. They would be her main companions 24/7, particularly the kids. By contrast, the Lascars were very much in a maritime organisation. They were within the shipping line as employer, and they were within the vessel. They were making this vessel work. Next slide, please, Claire. And obviously their physical situation at sea is important too. So ayahs would nominally be deck class, but about 50% would be in first or second class. And in 1911, a very interesting development happened. There started to be separate dormitories for ayahs and separate lavatories for ayahs, and even bathrooms where they could do the washing. So Ayahs and Amahs were recognised as such a permanent feature of ships that shipping companies like P&O made provision for them. And what I don't know and would love to know is, did they have access to those interesting places of tension on ships, the servants' hall, where the servants would be waited on by the stewards and stewardesses? My hunch is that ayahs wouldn't be allowed in there because they were seen as too low and, of course, native. By contrast, as we know, of course, Lascars were very much below decks, both for doing their work and in terms of accommodation too. They were confined, and for them there were no portholes to look after as there might be for an ayah in first class, and there was no promenading on deck as there would have been for ayahs and amahs, particularly taking the prams up and down the deck. Next slide, please, Claire. So in terms of their social situation at sea, the ayahs were within the employing family. They were solo, they didn't have any kin with them, and they were there as ladies or women. And that distinction is important because when there were shipwrecks, the man of the family would rescue not only his wife, but also her ayah or amah. So there was a very gendered idea of who you should look after, despite her colour. By comparison, Lascars were with their colleagues in a mass of people. Sorry, I don't know what I mean by unless there. I think that's a typo. They were part of a very established hierarchy on ship. You know, everybody knew the different grades of labour of Lascars, and they were there as males and seafarers, whereas ayahs were definitely not seafarers. Next slide, please, Claire. So we can see ayahs afloat as hybrids. They were working, but as passengers, not real workers like stewardesses. And the other worker passengers on a ship would be maids and governesses like these Northern nannies, butlers and valets, secretaries and hired companions, and concessionaires like my great-granddad, who was a ship's barber, but also the women who were working as bank staff and hairdressers increasingly. So there were many people on ship who were not proper passengers and not proper workers. Next slide, please, Claire. Where were they from? Lascars were mainly from coastal areas, but the ayahs were from everywhere, and particularly often cities near expats' residents, because this is how they could get jobs passed on to them. You know, you hung out where you were likely to find an employer who would take you on, and then the ayah would live in the compound. Next slide, please, Claire. So the formal arrangements for the voyage, the ayahs would have made a one-off contract with the sub, which wouldn't necessarily be written. The ayah wouldn't necessarily be literate. They were paid according to standard rates, which were known via the gossip mechanism. They weren't involved in having a career at sea. They were just doing this voyage because the employer required it. And they were usually working their passage back. They didn't come back as passengers. They mixed with the passengers, but were not equal. And they were a small number, as we've seen, and not systematically employed. It was an ad hoc arrangement. Certainly, absolutely certainly, there was no way that there'd be an attempt to unionise. There were attempts by stewardesses to unionise into a league of stewardesses, white women, and white women were part of the National Union of Seamen, but there's no way that an ayah would be part of this move because she was just there in a one-off way. And very interestingly, the courts were very sympathetic to ayahs who often were landed in Britain and dumped and destitute, and courts and charities would support the ayah and punish the employers who were seen as having reneged on the gentlemanly business of looking after this child or chattel of empire. By comparison, the Lascars were part of a very batched arrangement, arranged by the serang and line managed by the Tyndall. and they repeatedly sailed. It was their career to come and go, come and go, come and go. Until the 1850s, they were not allowed to work their passage back, so a way to fund their passage back had to be found by shipping lines, which caused resentment, and they were segregated from passengers, so Alaska would not do eye contact with a passenger. I mean, he was supposed to be more separate and subservient than that. Next slide, please, Claire. Just to now anchor Ayahs Voyages a bit at the conclusion. Next slide, please, Claire. So Ayahs were precariously employed female caregivers. They really were part of the precariat, just as so many Filipino maids are today. They had both economic and emotional reasons to sail. They needed the money, not least to keep their own kids going, but they also felt tenderness towards the employers' kids who they looked after. And normally these were one-off voyages. Most ayahs wouldn't make more than 3 or 4 voyages in a lifetime, though there is one who claimed to have done 57. I've looked at the stats. I don't see how she could have done it, but it's a great story. So they were connected to the employer by love of the children and by the habit of duty, and they were embedded as loyal British subjects, and they were listed as this mainly, particularly those coming from India, as British subjects in colonial families who were very keen on empire. So when they came to Britain, Ayahs and Amahs really wanted to go and see Buckingham Palace and really saw the Queen as the mother of their world. It was a very patriotic, traditional set of attitudes. Usually the ayah was the only employee that the family took on a voyage. Very occasionally there'd be an Asian bearer, or more commonly there would be a white nanny. We think that ayahs were under-aware of travel and of ships because this was time before movies and telly. And they ranged in agency between feeling very downtrodden and cautious, and some of them were very ready to sue angrily and feel uppity. And this seems to be particularly true of the Portuguese ayahs or amahs. So culturally, they are positioned as this very picturesque category on ships. Their coloured saris with the gold borders, their nose rings, kind of thing. They weren't really seen as individuals in their own right, as subjects, not objects to be gazed upon. It was certainly not a holiday cruise, and certainly they were venturing very unusually, singly, for women, for BA-ME women of their class. They were both motile and mobile at a time, certainly when my white British relatives couldn't possibly think of going on a ship as a paying passenger. It's far too costly before the 1950s. So there were some travelling ayahs who specialised in travelling rather than ayahs who travelled, but even they were not professional mariners. They were domestic workers who sailed a lot. Next slide, please, Claire. By contrast, Lascars were precariously employed, but not at the whim of one mensar bossar. They were male and they did masculine work, although Asian was coded as feminine, and generally they were unlikely to rebel and strike as white workers might. They could be 10 to 100% of the crew. They were numerically very significant, so their cooperation was crucial in the vessel getting safely to its destination. Work certainly wasn't a jaunt for them, and they were part of a group that had some solidarity, some sense of their rights, even though they might not have struck for them. Materially, they were segregated. They were on special Asiatic agreements. So when I first started looking at crew agreements on ships, I was really surprised to find that Lascars Asiatic agreements were a completely separate book, a register to white people. I had no idea that the segregation would be that great. It was really shocking to me. And also, Lascars were very much professional seafarers in their identity. They weren't just dipping in and out of it like ayahs. Next slide, please, Claire. So just to sum up, ayahs and Lascars as opposites aboard. Ayahs, there was this tenderness nexus. They cared and they were paid to care. They fitted in politely and they mixed a bit in the white world. You know, some passengers who were not their employers would speak to them a little bit. Um, by contrast, Lascars entirely had an economic nexus with their people involved in the voyage. They expected hostility and the need to fight their ground at times, and they were much more segregated than the ayahs. So both of them were natives, in quotes, but labour crucial to the elite white people on the voyage. They were viewed as picturesque and loyal and not a real threat, not dreadful like some sailors were seen as being. And some could act with a sense of agency and rights. They didn't take the racism lying down, not always. Next slide, please, Claire. So here's a few ways of learning more about ayahs. There's an Ayahs Amahs research network, a global one that's just started this year that I'm involved in, and it's producing some really lovely stories that you can read on the website at ayahsamahs.com. There's an Instagram site which has pictures of the Ayahs home in Hackney. And if you want to read about ayahs on ships, I've done a couple of entries to my blog, so you can see the links here. One of the best ways to look quickly and for free at the history of Lascars is to look at a really good P&O website that's up there. The more deep-looking books are Lascars in the Indian Ocean and Indian Ocean Seafaring by Aaron Jaffa. And to get an earlier picture of Asian travellers with Lascars as part of them, it's a really good idea to look at Michael H. Fisher's Counterflows to Colonialism. I've also done a biography of BA-ME seafarers, which you can look at this site. I'm going to go on to the final slide, but Claire is going to flash this reading list up again in a minute, so you can come back to it if you need to rush away and get a pencil or a tablet to insert the links. I may say that this talk is also going to be on Blaydes History Department's YouTube channel later. Martin will be sending you out details of that. Final slide, please, Claire. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's been really lovely talking to you. I really enjoyed preparing this for you in a way that I hope would work for you. Do talk to me. I love sharing ideas and chatting and hearing your suggestions. So you can contact me on Gmail. There's a website that's in general about me, joestanley.biz, and my blog on gender and the sea also includes class and race. So if we could leave that up for a minute, Claire, and then flash back to the bibliography, and I'll say thank you and over to Martin for your questions and comments.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Joe. I found that fascinating. Certainly, I've got a couple of questions, but if anybody else does, the system has to be on this platform that you need to type them into the questions box. I'm afraid I'm not sure what people are seeing, but I have a questions box in front of me. So if anybody does have any questions, please do type them into that box, and I can then either unmute your microphone and you can ask them directly, or I can just read them out. Kind of up to you on that score. While anybody's thinking of any questions you may have, I've got one or two, Joe, if I could abuse chair's privilege.
Ooh.
Firstly, I was fascinated by those figures that you presented, showing the decadal figures for Ayahs
Yeah.
Amahs, and that enormous drop-off from the 1920s to the 1930s. I'd have expected that for the 40s, but for the 30s seems rather earlier, and I'm just wondering why. Any ideas?
None at all so far. None at all. One possibility may be that actually Ayahs and Amahs were using different routes to get to the UK. And so what I've got recorded is the people mainly arriving in Plymouth and Liverpool, but so many people like to travel overland up from India all the way up through Egypt and then up through Italy and then would go through France and then just cross over the channel from France to England. So those people aren't listed. So I'm wondering if that's one of the explanations. I think another explanation may be poverty and housing shortage, that by the 1930s there were so few British people with big enough houses or whose parents had big enough houses to hire an extra staff member when they came over for a few weeks, that it became less common to bring your ayah or amah over with you.
Yes, that would make sense, wouldn't it? Combined perhaps with the impact of the Great Depression.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Right, I do have a couple of questions. I hope this will work. Question from Jenny McLeod, who Jenny, you'll need to unmute yourself, I think. I don't think I can unmute you here. Right, okay. Problems with the technology. I'll just read the question out in that case, if I may. Jenny, so thanks for a very interesting talk, Joe. Could you tell me about the kinds of sources you've used to piece this together? How difficult is it to find information directly from Ayahs or Lascars themselves?
Ayahs and Lascars, actually, great question. Ayahs and Lascars, very difficult to find out from them, particularly from the early period. A lot of the data comes from the passenger numbers, which you can get via Ancestry, but there's very limited information, but it does enable you to get quite a good picture quantitatively, so you can see things like how old would an ayah be typically in relation to her memsab? How many children typically would an ayah be looking after on a trip? What the dad's job would be, say military or civil service. But in general, the great tragedy, the thing that causes us historians to wring our hands is, wanting to know about the women's subjective experience and not knowing very much at all. There's a bit in newspapers when they're dumped and when they tell their story in court, and so these stories are very sympathetically told by journalists. And there's occasional 1 or 2 line references in books by British people travelling in the Raj, saying how picturesque the ayah looked, sitting down at the bottom of the stairs on the ship, rocking her baby. But really, it's a terribly imbalanced story of rough numbers and an absolute absence of the real women's experience. I think the best known is Carolyn Pereira's story. She took a case to the Old Bailey. It goes on for probably about 20 pages actually, and it really gives you a very good picture of life on a ship, including the racism that she experienced from the steward and from some of the other passengers who robbed her. And it also gives you a picture of the way her employers ended up thinking she cheated them, but also it feels like they cheated her. It's a very confused story and a very interesting one. Oh, and I've talked to some kids of ours. Yeah, I've done some sort of oral history work and genealogy work. So I have talked to a man called Jupiter Sen, who was a baby in arms when the last ayah came over in 1953. and he and his mum, who's still around, both can't remember that they even had an ayah with them. So there ain't much, but at least I've talked to people who've had ayahs, if only those ayahs have been in India. So I get some sense of the nexus, and particularly the love, the tenderness. The poet Michael Andanche refers to his ayah Rosalind as his almost mother, and I think it's very important to bear that in mind. The Ayahs Amahs were almost mothers, and sometimes more beloved than the real mother, the blood mother. Do you want to come back, Jenny, with supplementary?
It will pop up in the box, Joe, if she does. So
Okay.
we'll hang fire on that one.
I think she said she had to go early, so maybe it won't.
Possibly, yes. That actually ties in with another question I've got, but I won't abuse chair's privilege because we have another question. Could you say more about the recruitment of ayahs? Did they work with the families for a long time and then undertake a voyage because the family was doing this, or were they employed specifically for the voyage?
It's a really good question. Both things are true. We don't know how long ayahs were with families before they would do the voyage. I think probably an ayah would be working in a family, and then if the family had to go back to England, say because the Saab was on furlough, then if she was trusted and loved, she would be asked to go with them. If there was a house that would house her at the other end, she would be asked to go. And also, if the mother had several children and perhaps was pregnant, then again the ayah would be recruited. So it was partly about the Memsahib's need to have a lot of domestic support. What we don't know, and would be very interesting to know, is how much some of the Ayahs and Amahs were wet nurses, meaning that they were providing milk for the British children because the Memsahib wasn't providing that milk herself. So an ayah may have been very crucial on that voyage in keeping the British child alive. And recruitment normally happened by word of mouth, that people would pass on ayahs from one family to the next. When ayahs came to Britain and they were waiting around for a return trip to India, then some of them stayed at the ayah's home. And so a memsahib who wanted an ayah would go there or write to there and say, have you got anybody who could sail on August the 25th? Must be able to speak French and Portuguese or something like that. Must be a good sailor.
Yes, supplementary question. Why would the ayah not work on the way back from Britain to the east? Surely
Um,
some families would want to take a trip back.
but they may not want the ayah hanging around for 6 months or a year. It would depend on how long a period they were going to be in Britain. And so the ayah might be wanting to go back, particularly if her own kids were young and she was missing them. You know, she might not want to hang about. So I can only get a general impression from the stats, but I would have thought probably about 8% of ayahs went back empty, if you like, with no children. But because they weren't described necessarily as ayahs, but say Jemima Chakrabarti, so you don't actually know, was she an ayah or was she just an Asian woman who was traveling to India?
Yeah, it was ever the problem with such records, wasn't it? Identifying who you're actually looking for.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
question that occurred to me, I sort of hinted at it a moment ago. You mentioned on one occasion governesses, and I was
yeah.
just wondering if you'd seen anything about the interplay between ayahs and governesses. Is there anything at all?
I think I'm going
One
to
could
have to write
imagine
a
a
novel.
world of tensions.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to write a novel about this because I don't think there's enough information. Um, I imagine there was huge tensions, and if you remember that picture of the Norland nannies, they look quite tough cookies, don't they? I would
Mm,
not like to cross one of those women. In fact, I wouldn't like to employ one of them. Actually, she'd terrify me.
that's the
So
stereotypical image of governesses as well, isn't it?
yeah. So generally, the governess would have high status, much higher status than the ayah. Scottish ones had the reputation of being strict. So a couple of people I know who had ayahs in the 1930s said, we felt very sorry for the kids who had Scottish governesses, because we had ayah who doted on us, whereas the Scottish governesses, made life hell, really. um, so I imagine there was huge rivalry about whose baby was it, and who was most loved by the children. Um, I'm sure it's a subject of a murder melodrama, probably, if somebody was to write it as fiction.
Unfortunately, that's probably all we can do, isn't it? Write it as fiction.
Yeah.
Right. Well, last call for questions. If there are any further to come in, it's a case of type now or forever hold your peace. Right. Well, in that case, I think we'll draw this session to a close. So thank you very much once again, Joe. Thank you on several levels. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I certainly learned a lot from that. I hope others did too. Thank you for being our technological guinea pig. It seems to have worked reasonably well. So we will be doing this again. I'll confirm the date or we will confirm the date and time via social media, via the mailing lists and so on and so forth. But it will be the first week of December, and the speaker will be David Starkey. And then we hope to restart face-to-face events at Blaydes early in the new year. So thank you very much, those who've attended this evening, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And finally, once again, thank you very much, Joe, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you for great sharing, Martin, and thank you to Claire in the background who made it so
Yes,
feasible for us
definitely.
to
Thank you, Claire.